Soo Kim is a revered and respected Korean author whose novel The Plotters I really enjoyed. I did a written review of that book back in the day, which I'll link below so that you can go read it. But The Plotters is a really fun and engaging novel about an assassin who works out of a library in Seoul. And it's set during the South Korean dictatorship, after the Korean War, but before the 1980 Gwangju uprising that led to the democratization of South Korea. It's a really fun novel, and I had a lot of fun reading and reviewing it back in the early days of Books and Bao. Then, a good while ago, I was in a bookshop with my partner who happened to pick up another Soo Kim novel. That novel is The Cabinet, which sounded great. My partner immediately read it, and it might have been the first Korean novel they ever read, and they loved it, absolutely, completely. And then the hounding started. You need to read this, you need to check it out. And I kept saying, I know, I've read one of his other books, I really enjoyed it, I promise I'll get to it. I love Korean novels, I made Books and Bao out of loving Korean and Japanese novels, I'll get to it. Time goes by, TBR pile gets bigger, blah blah blah. I should have read this book ages ago, my partner was right. I knew that I was going to enjoy it, and I have finally read The Cabinet, and it is fantastic. It is so much fun. There are a few things that it feels similar to, and I would not say it's derivative of those things at all. It just reminded me of them, and they're all things that I really enjoy. For example, The Twilight Zone, and the video games of a Finnish studio called Remedy, who made Alan Wake, Max Payne, and it's their game Control that The Cabinet really reminds me of. If you like the surreal and uncanny nature of the games that Remedy puts out, if you love The Twilight Zone, if you even like things like Twin Peaks, you're gonna have a lot of fun with The Cabinet. The Cabinet is an interesting piece of fiction in that it blends short stories with a longer underlying bit of prose. It's a novel, but a novel that is full of short stories. They make up probably more than half the book, but they all serve a purpose. They all feed into the wider narrative. The cabinet in question is something called Cabinet 13. When the book begins, our protagonist deeply and repeatedly reinforces the fact that this is just a metal filing cabinet that you'd find in any office anywhere in the world. He really needs you to picture the most basic, plain filing cabinet that you could possibly imagine. Grey, metallic, beaten up, that. But Cabinet 13 is unique, obviously. It contains files on various people from all around the world, but mostly focused on South Korean citizens and the city of Seoul. These people are all unique in some way, reminiscent of the kinds of things you'd see in the Twilight Zone or even maybe the mutants from X-Men. They're people who either have weird physiology or weird abilities that allow them to do something strange, but as you go on reading it, you will be floored by the sheer number of these people, making them seem more ordinary than perhaps you're comfortable with. And when the novel opens, we get a series of stories about these people to give you an idea of what the cabinet stores. And our protagonist, Mr. Kong, is just in charge of it. His job is to be the caretaker of the cabinet. So you read multiple short stories, chapters make up stories about these strange people and the things that they can do. And as we go on, we slowly learn more about Kong and how he ended up in this position. The novel is separated into 3 parts, and they kind of serve as a babushka doll. Part 1 is exactly half of the novel. Part 2 is 2/3 of what's left. And part 3 is 1/3 of what's left. So they're getting progressively smaller. And part 1 is majority short stories from this Cabinet 13. But by the time we get to part 2, in the second half of the novel, we are primarily learning about Kong and getting some context around the cabinet. Kong's boss, the guy who has been filling the cabinet up with these files on certain people, why he started doing it, what it's all for. You eventually start to piece things together as the stories slip away and the main narrative takes center stage. And obviously I'm not going to spoil any of that, but just rest assured it's all there for the most part. The novel actually opens with a relatively lengthy story, which almost reads as a kind of legend or fable about a town that was nestled in the shadow of a volcano, and that volcano eventually erupted, Pompeii style, killing everyone, except for one guy. And the reason he survived is because this town had a very tall tower at its centre, like the Tower of London, an enormous stories-high prison, and this guy was the prisoner at the top of the tower, and so he survived. And we eventually learned that he fled to, I think, South America, and he ended up writing weird stories about the people that lived there. But all of his accounts about these people are not accurate. He describes the people of this town in ways that aren't true, and the novel, in a kind of metafictional way, asks the question, why? Why did he write these accounts? Why did he depict people in monstrous ways, giving them X-Men style abilities and making up things like they had a tail or they had 3 eyes or something? At first it says, well, you, the reader, might think that it's because he hated these people. They put him in jail and now they're all dead and he's just getting his spiteful revenge. But then the narrator says, actually, it's probably the case that he missed them all, and he was creating fantastical stories about them in a fun way. There's not much point to this first story except for maybe to frame the theme of the story, the idea that abnormality is in fact normality, and what is normal, what constitutes an ordinary person, an ordinary life. Because that's the thing, I don't really know what the novel is about. It's just a fun story about strange people. It's a Twilight Zone style story. The people in this cabinet have weird abilities. For example, there are apparently thousands of people all around the world who sustain themselves on things that should not be consumed, like gasoline, glass, and steel. There are people who lose time, who just suddenly snap and wake up somewhere else, months in the future. There's one guy whose story features early in the book, but he comes up multiple times all the way to the end, which is this man called Mr. Kim, who has a ginkgo tree growing out of his finger. And we learn the story of Mr. Kim. And these short stories are contained in a way, but frequently Mr. Kong appears in them. He will pull a file out of the cabinet and start reading it and telling you about a strange person. But as that person's story goes on, Kong will feature in it. Something like, Mr. Kim came to see me and told me about the tree growing out of his finger, and we talked about it, and eventually I put him in the cabinet. It's weird, it's fun, it's really, really engaging, and I was really impressed with the way that the novel shifted as it went on. Like I said, lots and lots of short stories about weird people with weird abilities, and then the novel kind of filters all of that out, streamlines itself into a story about Mr. Kong, his childhood, his job, his previous job, his boss, relationships he's had, difficult times in his life. We slowly piece together who Kong is. And therefore we also kind of learn more about the cabinet and the context around it. Part 3, and I'm not spoiling anything by saying this, kind of takes a bit of a genre shift where the book goes from surreal short stories to something very intense and action-focused, kind of a thriller. And Unsoo Kim is known for writing thrillers. The Plotters is a kind of thriller. So I'm not too surprised. But it certainly gives the impression that as the novel goes on, there is a breadth to it. We're reading a slew of stories about all kinds of people all around the world, and things get narrower and narrower and narrower, like a pyramid. As the story goes on, we are funneled deeper into the life and the mind and the experiences of Mr. Kong and where he's going to end up. And it's really, really satisfying. The cabinet is a weird thing. It's a very engaging and strange thing. And I am so glad I read it. What a brilliant story. Like I said, I'm not entirely sure if there's a purpose to this book, except to highlight that abnormality is pretty normal. As a queer person, I hugely related to that. When you think about individual lives versus people being used as a statistic, things get a bit murky and kind of sad. Like, for example, I know a lot of trans people, myself included. From my perspective, trans people are everywhere. And the media also wants you to think trans people are everywhere and also dangerous. Then you say, but the statistic is that 0.5% of people are trans. That's 1 in 200 people. That's not a lot. But it also is in the grand scheme of things. And so people who are different, people who are queer, actually make up an astonishing number. Whether or not you think that's good or bad depends on how bigoted you are. But this book has a similar approach where it's painting these pictures of all of these weird lives, these people who are strange, but quite often they are one of a group. The enormous group of people who eat glass. The enormous group of people who jump through time. Suddenly, their abnormality, their strangeness, their queerness is not so queer, is not so strange. It's ordinary. It's a minority group, but it's a large one. I do think the theme of abnormality or unusualness or being part of a minority, it's a very exhausted theme. But the book definitely takes a unique approach to it and has you thinking about it in a slightly more subtle way. I mentioned the X-Men comics earlier, which were originally created as an allegory for the civil rights movement. Mutants were minorities. Mutants were an allegory for black people or women, people with fewer rights. X-Men comics have a widely queer readership because we relate to the stories. There's a moment in the second X-Men movie from like 2002 where a mother talks to her son about being a mutant, and she literally uses the stereotypical words and phrases that parents use when their kids come out as gay. Things like, have you tried not being gay? Have you tried not being a mutant? These allegories are very obvious. And allegories often need to be obvious to make the point, but The Cabinet is much more subtle. You don't really have to think about all this stuff, and I might be off. I might be wrong. Thematically, this is a book where you could just ignore those elements and enjoy a weird collection of surreal tales that eventually funnels into a kind of a thriller. But critical analysis and using your imagination and your intelligence is important when reading literally any book, so I can't help myself, and you shouldn't either. Trying to make heads or tails of The Cabinet isn't easy, but it's certainly fun and challenging and exciting to do, and the book is fun and challenging and exciting in its own right, even just on a narrative level. The amount of imagination that's been put into this is excellent, is inspiring, honestly. Unsoo Kim is a great writer, and I'm so glad I finally read The Cabinet. It took me a minute, should have read it earlier, didn't, better late than never. The Cabinet is fantastic. Unsoo Kim is an amazing Korean author. Check out his stuff, check out The Cabinet, check out The Plotters as well. Like I said, my written review will be linked in the description, along with a list of other great Korean books for you to check out. So happy reading, and subscribe for books.